Representative Kurt Zellers and Senator Amy Koch don't understand the gravity of a shutdown for the state of Minnesota.
Democratic Visions is handmade by volunteers for the entire metro region by DFL Senate District 42.
I was out and about a week ago and heard Representative Keith Downey, who represents my House district, was promoting his idea of cutting the state workforce by 15%, and I've read earlier that he described that as a part of his mindset of starving the beast. And he was rightfully criticized for injecting divisive and inflammatory ideas into what should be civil political discourse. What do you think about the idea of cutting back on the state employees?
You know, we've been cutting since 2003 in Minnesota. When Governor Pawlenty was first elected and there was that $4.5 billion deficit in 2003 and 2004, a lot of the fat and waste was cut and numerous efficiencies were found. And then we found ourselves in 2009 and 2010 doing deep cutting again. So we've been cutting for almost a decade. The easy cuts are gone. And now if you talk about reducing the state workforce by 15%, you talk about making the state 15% less effective in the things that it needs to do, like plow the roads, make sure insurance companies aren't ripping people off, and things we would all agree we want our state government to take care of.
Senator Jeff Michel was recently quoted as stating that Governor Dayton's proposed tax increase on the wealthiest 2% would be, quote unquote, bad for business. What do your constituents tell you about that kind of argument?
Well, the thing about Senator Michel's statements there is that they fail to recognize the way businesses operate in the world.
You're in a small business, aren't you?
Absolutely. And when the tax rates go up on the earnings of the owners, in order to avoid taxes, what do? They invest. They buy capital equipment. They hire more employees. They increase their charitable deductions. In fact, raising individual income tax rates on very wealthy individuals drives them to invest more in their small businesses if they have them. You know, the Republicans talk about emulating North Dakota and South Dakota and places like Nebraska.
Might as well throw in Alabama, Mississippi, and Texas while you're at it.
And you just ask yourself, how many Fortune 500 companies per capita do they have? And we beat them far and away. And the reason we do is we have a very highly educated workforce, and that is worth money to companies.
It seems to me that the Republican intent is to convert Minnesota into a backwater third-tier state, and I appreciate the efforts of you and other DFLers to oppose that. So what do you think? I stated my opinion. I think there's going to be a state shutdown. Do you concur?
Unfortunately, I think that there will be, because I think that Representative Kurt Zellers and Senator Amy Koch don't understand the gravity of a shutdown for the state of Minnesota.
And they don't care about the consequences either?
I think that they see the idea of 35,000 state employees not getting a paycheck as a minor inconvenience. What they don't realize is that the grocers and the movie theaters and the nurses and the doctors in their local hospitals won't get paid either.
What's going to happen to the school systems?
You know, that's really a question we don't know the answer to right now. I understand that in all likelihood the K-12 system would be able to start up, but the state college and university system would not be functional.
Briefly about another interest of yours. I know you're on the House committee dealing with redistricting. How is that coming into play at the present time? I know that the bill that was passed, I think without any Democrat support whatsoever, was vetoed by Governor Dayton. Do you think we're going to see another Republican measure come forward in that regard?
I don't. I don't think the Republicans were ever committed to the legislative process. Before we even convened the legislature, they organized a nonprofit group and started raising money for the litigation battle in the courts. So unfortunately, I think they went into the legislative session with an idea that they were doomed to end up in the courts, and they were going to put the best Republican map they could out there. They really didn't make any effort to look at minority representation, which we're required to do under the Voting Rights Act of 1965. They didn't make any attempt to look at communities that made sense. You know, which kids go to school together, which communities naturally ally themselves in shared police services, shared fire departments. So unfortunately, we got a very good map for Republicans and not a good map for the state of Minnesota.
Was this a backroom process, or was there any public input?
It was 100% backroom. The map was drafted with very little public input. We had 14 rather cursory hearings where we got a smidgen of input from people, but we had no map. And then when we did have a map, 24 hours later, we shot that baby over to the House floor without really asking Minnesotans to weigh in and to give us their perspective on how to make it better.
Did you, as a member of the committee, have any input at all in the process?
No.
Right after the session ended, Republican leaders made a big show of flying to different parts of Minnesota to explain their position. State Party Chair Tony Sutton blew insults at Mark Dayton and was rightly and roundly scolded by the press for doing so. DFL legislators, for their part, throughout the state went door to door to listen to their voters. Representative Steve Simon was among them.
I mean, I think if the polls are to be believed, people all over Minnesota, particularly swing voters in areas like Minnetonka, Eden Prairie, St. Louis Park, they're seeking some sort of balanced solution. They're not stuck in the extremes. And I suspect what we're going to see tonight is what Minnesotans all over the state are saying that they want, which is, again, a balanced, reasonable blend of spending cuts, of course. That comes first. We know that. But also some revenue increases, reasonable and targeted revenue increases.
Melissa, I'm sure you've been talking to your constituents. What's their take on the situation?
People want us to find a compromise. They want both sides to give.
Not unlike what we see in the Star Tribune polls, I assume.
Absolutely. 75% of the people I hear from want compromise. Well, you know, Governor Dayton has already come halfway from his initial position. His initial position was to raise $3.6 billion in revenue. He already cut that in half and went to $1.8 billion. It's time for a really meaningful and substantial move by the Republicans, and I don't know what form that will take.
Well, the Republicans seem to think we're born under a rock because they seem to want to repackage their proposal and call it something new. I see recently that they took Governor Dayton's education and judicial funding and said, well, we'll use your numbers, but we're not budging off of our $34 billion package. Well, that's interesting, but what does that accomplish?
No, they failed to account for where would they make another $110 million in cuts. Their Health and Human Services budget already would lose 30,000 jobs in the state of Minnesota. So I don't know how they can propose to cut Health and Human Services even further. And then the other significant budget out there was higher ed budget. Are they proposing to take another $110 million from MnSCU and the University of Minnesota and take them, what, back to the 1995 funding levels?
Well, President Brunigs of the University of Minnesota has labeled this a disaster and has rightfully come up with a plan, hopefully never to be implemented, where tuition will continue to skyrocket. That can't be acceptable to average Minnesotans, can it?
No, you know, I think that they've learned from Tim Pawlenty that when you cut higher education and you cut local government aid, middle-class taxpayers have unaffordable tuition and unaffordable property taxes. It's time for us to get off the merry-go-round of just making the middle class pay more, whether it's in tuition or property taxes, and to have a sustainable solution where actually the wealthiest 2% pay their fair share.
You made a good point that we shouldn't lose sight of, which is the effect on property taxes. If a budget anywhere near what has been proposed by the Republican would be enacted, what do your constituents think about property taxes? Do you hear stories about how it's going to price them actually out of their houses?
You know, the property tax is the most hated tax because it bears no relationship to a person's ability to pay. The property tax doesn't care if you lost your job.
My grandmother that's 85 years old and is still living in a house that she's lived in for 50 years is going to have to pay increased taxes, although she has no income stream to speak of?
Right. She'll not only will she pay more in property taxes, but she'll also lose any sort of property tax rebate that she might have, where we have a circuit breaker program to try to make property taxes a little more affordable. The Republicans want to take a nice big whack at that, and that will predominantly hurt senior citizens.
Democratic Visions is handmade by volunteers for DFL Senate District 42, Lori Pryor, Chair. Democratic Visions can also be seen on YouTube and at dflsd42.org.